Thank you all for joining us today and taking part in this talk. Let me thank Paula Zadigian, the Manager of Public Programs, as well as Tony Dellaversano, the Public Programs Associate, for arranging this presentation and for guiding me through the technical aspects of doing this talk. Today, I will give you a brief overview of cylinder seals from ancient Mesopotamia and show you how the Morgan Library and Museum presents this remarkable material in a new way on our website, where you can actually rotate the seal stones themselves and zoom in for spectacular details. No other site does this. The website was designed by Dan Friedman, and he's the Senior Manager of Digital Media at the Morgan, and I thank him for his invaluable work. Every image that you will see of the seals today and their impressions would not have been remotely possible, without the tremendous assistance of Marilyn Palmieri, Imaging and Rights Manager at the Morgan, and above all, the Morgan's master photographer, Graham Haber. These images of the seals and their impressions involving painstaking hours of adjusting lights and involved tremendous patience from Graham in putting up with me throughout the entire process. I cannot thank him enough, really. Thank you, Graham. On the screen is the 1906 McKim building that you all know and cherish as the Morgan Library, and we hope to be able to reopen it for you soon. This very building is considered the masterpiece of the American Renaissance architectural movement, and the purpose of that movement was to bring the ideals of the Italian Renaissance to this country and try to transplant those ideals on American soil through the arts and architecture. The Civil War had a profound effect on those of Morgan's generation, and it was hoped that through culture and education, such a tragedy would never be repeated. The sober facade gives way to the dazzling splendor of the rotunda, providing a setting that visually emphasizes the importance of what is in the building and that it is worthy of scholarly pursuit. Morgan used much of his wealth to bring the material evidence of the world's culture to this country. His efforts were perhaps the most significant of a national movement to enhance the cultural life of America itself. In 1910, Pierpont Morgan received a letter from Mark Twain responding to Morgan's request for the author's manuscript of Pudd'nhead Wilson. This bears repeating now in the remarkable times that we are all living through. Twain replied, quote, "One of my high ideals is gratified, which is to have something of mine placed elbow to elbow with that august company which you have gathered together to remain indestructible in a perishable world," end of quote. That august company included Morgan's legendary collection of ancient Mesopotamian seals and cuneiform tablets. On the screen is what appears to be a large sculpture relief carved with great detail. It dates to around the 7th century BC, during the time of the Neo-Babylonians and the legendary Nebuchadnezzar. The scene depicts a demonic lion facing a winged superhuman hero. The lion's threatening gestures and the tension in the span of his sharp claws suggests his evil power, but the hero will be the victor. Taller than the lion, he acts with a calm force, and the bull, the victim or prize of the contest, remains in his power. Despite the violence in the action, the figure seems suspended in time, a result of the symmetry of the design. The subject of an heroic being protecting a domesticated animal from an attacking lion has a long tradition in Mesopotamia. Here on the screen, in all its majestic grandeur, this very image represents the culmination of several thousand years of Mesopotamian art. However, this relief is in reality only about 1 inch high and was made by me by rolling a stone cylinder, as shown on the left, onto a soft material. In the miniature space of the seal, the artist has created a contest of monumental proportions. This is the magnificent, monumental miniature world of ancient Mesopotamian cylinder seals. All of the impressions you will see today and on the website, as well as on view in the library, were made by me. It has taken me years to perfect the technique in order to create an even and true impression of each seal. Before we go further and discuss the importance of viewing the stones as well as the impressions, let us briefly orient ourselves. On the left is a map of the modern boundaries of the land the ancient Greeks called Mesopotamia. You are all now familiar with this map showing the modern state of Iraq from the news, relating all its chaos over the last several decades. And on the right is a satellite view of the region. Turkey is up here to the north, where the two great rivers of Mesopotamia, the Tigris and the Euphrates, have their sources. And below is the great floodplain, all of this of southern Mesopotamia. What you may not know is that from here, with the border with Turkey in the north, all the way to the Gulf in the south, the level of the land changes only about 30 feet. The land is awesomely flat, with no quantities of stone, timber, metals, or minerals. The raw material that epitomizes Mesopotamian civilization is mud, refined into clay and used in the almost exclusively mud brick architecture, as shown here on the right in the great ziggurat of Ur, as it has dominated the unrelentingly flat landscape for over 4,000 years to this very day. Mesopotamia bears the stamp of clay, as does no other civilization, and nowhere in the world but in Mesopotamia did people hold the idea of using soft clay as the vehicle for impressed signs to which established meanings were then assigned, an intellectual achievement that amounted to nothing less than the invention of writing. On the screen is an actual sun-dried cuneiform tablet from the Morgan collection, dating to the mid-second millennium BC. The tablet is less than 4 inches high, and this is all the cuneiform inscription. And here you can see it is impressed, or signed as it were, on its edge with a seal in order to authenticate the text of the tablet. You see two standing figures here, and this is the caps of the cylinder seal. On the screen are a number of these cylinder seals. Again, the largest here is less than 1.5 inches. They are among the smallest objects ever produced by sculptors. You can immediately see the beauty in the variety of materials such as white and colored marbles, lapis lazuli, jaspers, carnelians, rock crystal, bandit agates, and a variety of chalcedonies, among others. None of these stones were available locally, and all were imported from great distances, such as the lapis lazuli coming from Afghanistan. The seals were all drilled, you see through here at the top, so they could be worn. Indeed, a primary function of these seals was amuletic. A particular stone was thought to have a specific property that would have a beneficial effect on its wearer. The stones such as lapis lazuli, jasper, rock crystal, and many others were often named in Mesopotamian dream and omen literature with their intrinsic metaphysical properties and beautiful colors. Quote, if someone carries a seal of lapis lazuli, he will have protection and his God will rejoice in him. If he wears a seal of mushushu rock, which is actually rock crystal, he will have good fortune wherever he may go. Those are just two of a number of these. Moreover, a seal had a direct relationship to a particular individual. For the seal identified what it was used to seal, a vessel, a sack, a storeroom, or cuneiform tablet, as we have seen, as the responsibility of or an authentication by a specific person. To that extent, seals represent the earliest pictorial representation of a person. On the left is an ancient jar sealing from a private collection, and it was rolled around 2300 BC. And this is all that survives of what must have been a spectacular cylinder seal, now lost in the remotest past. You see two heroic figures wrestling with lions. Here's a lion, another lion, an inscription, and it was repeated again here. And this would have been placed over the neck of a jar to secure a cloth covering the top of the jar. And on the right is the tablet, again, from the Morgan Library that I have shown you. Here on the right is a drawing of a shell inlay showing a woman wearing a seal right here, suspended from her garment pin. This is the cord, that's the seal, and that's the garment pin. The original is in the Metropolitan Museum, and on the left is shown how the great Lady Puabi was found in her tomb at the Royal Cemetery of Ur in the late 1920s, showing her garment pins with her seal. This is her elaborate headdress, much more elaborate than Our Lady on the right. Her shoulders were here. Everything's been removed, but here is the garment pin that you see here, and that's one of her seals as found flopping up as it was left in her burial. The importance of seals to their owners has survived in a biblical text from the Song of Solomon, 8:6, in which the bridegroom tells his beloved, quote, "Wear me as a seal upon thine heart, as a seal upon thine arm, for love is as strong as death, passion cruel as the grave. It blazes up like blazing fire, fiercer than any flame," end of quote. What this means is that since seals were so personal, they were not buried with you. So if you were worn as the seal upon someone's heart, and therefore buried with that person as here, you would be together for eternity and your love would transcend death. Here is exactly one of those seals referred to in the biblical text and carved 3,300 years ago. The impression is below, and above are various views of the stone itself that can be found on our website. The seal is a beautiful milky chalcedony, as you see above, and it shows a leaping stag in a landscape. This could be a royal image, as an epithet for ruler or prince at the time was the same as the word for stag. With that in mind, an echo of its meaning is surely to be found in a biblical text from the Song of Solomon 2:8-9, in which the bride speaks of her bridegroom, quote, "The voice of my beloved, behold, he cometh leaping upon the mountains, skipping upon the hills. My beloved is like a roe or a young hart," end of quote. This could be an illustration of that passage. Whether it is or is not the point. All of this is in the air at the time. Holland Carter, art critic for the New York Times, has described the image on this seal in particular, quote, "A leaping stag carved around 1300 BC is a masterpiece of sculptural relief. The animal's startled eyes and taut muscles are caught with exquisite, not a stroke wasted naturalism. Two trees that flank him are near abstract bursts of line, mid-air explosions, talk about elegance," end of quote. And this model gray limestone seal is perhaps one of the most striking animal representations in all of Mesopotamian art. Again, the limestone seal at the top in several views from our website, and the impression below made by me. This dates again to about 1300 years before Christ. It shows a male figure pursuing an ostrich, here possibly representing the earthly equivalent of the griffin, thought to be the conveyor of death. In other words, the hero here is trying to overcome or conquer death. In a biblical text from the Old Testament in the book of Job 39:13-17, the ostrich is indeed considered a malevolent creature. And the reason given is that it disdains its young, which may actually help to explain the young ostrich here sort of being shunted off to the side by the fleeing adult. Notice the wonderful naturalism of the squawking head, and as the hero grasps the tail feathers of the bird, the wing feathers bristle up in anger and annoyance at being molested by the hero. And also notice how the entire design is balanced on this magnificent diagonal line starting in the upper left-hand corner, starting here through the shoulders of the hero into the tail feathers down to the bottom. The whole is beautifully balanced, a magnificent work of art in miniature. Pierpont Morgan was justifiably proud of his collection of ancient Mesopotamian cylinder seals. In 1909, a privately printed volume appeared, which published illustrations of 300 impressions out of the some 1,100 seals in Morgan's collection. The author was the Reverend William Hayes Ward, who was fascinated by how the images on the seals might inform biblical studies. Ward summarized Morgan's intentions as follows, quote, "It is the chief project, as I understand it, of Mr. Morgan in bringing to this country The written and figural monuments of the early East, such as tablets, seal cylinders, bas-reliefs, or statues, to put within the reach of American scholars the material necessary for adding to the knowledge of the world. End of quote. This volume from 1909 was the very first publication of cylinder seals in America. Here is an illustration of an impression of a seal dating to about the 12th century BC from that volume in what was then a lavish, groundbreaking publication showing for the first time photographs of modern impressions of Morgan seals. The impression is not up to the standards that have been developed since. Look how it's not clearly cut, and as the impression was made, the whole image started to become distended. This is too much of a distance between the legs, and by the time you get to a repeat of the inscription, all the lines are curved. They're not straight any longer. Never mind. This was the first publication of seals, and is that extremely important. Also notice that the lighting is somewhat uneven across the surface of the seal, and much of the detail is missing. So be it. The publication had a run of 250 copies and was therefore not widely distributed. A year later, in 1910, Ward himself published the first comprehensive book of seals for a wide distribution, and included 3,300 known examples of seals, however, published in line drawing only. Here is the same seal, now numbered 707, and it was by these line drawings, this one here, and it was by these line drawings that the Morgan seals were known for the next 38 years, until the Morgan seals were beautifully published in 1948 by Edith Perrotta. She was the first curator of seals in the history of the Morgan Library. This was the first publication to treat seals as works of art, not just iconographical information, and present them as such. Here is that same impression, or this is Perrotta's impression. This is that same impression of the same seal as published by Edith Perrotta's corpus. Notice how beautifully cut it is. The impression is not distended as the rolling has gone by. Everything is nice and straight and lined up, and how beautifully raked the lighting is evenly across the surface of the cylinder seal. Scholarship focused on the seals because, as I have said before, Mesopotamia is basically a massive floodplain lacking in stone. There is none of the monumental stone architecture or quantities of stone sculpture that attest to the achievements of Egypt, Greece, and Rome. Therefore, the images engraved on the seals, to be understood by making modern impressions, represent the largest body of pictorial information to have survived from ancient Mesopotamia, and provide a unique chronological and artistic sequence for well over 3,000 years. The publication of the Morgan seals in 1948 by Edith Perrotta remains to this day a standard reference, and is how the Morgan seals have been known for the last 72 years. But of course, what has been missing all this time is this image of the actual object itself. Here is the magnificent seal stone that made that impression in the Perrotta publication, a brilliant red sard. For over a century, the information provided has been incomplete, limited to a drawing of the impression, or at best the impressions themselves in various qualities of rolling and often unpredictable lighting. This is unfortunate for two reasons. First, here is an impression of a famous seal in Berlin, as published in the late 30s, and is the image of this seal that is often reproduced. The description of the image identifies the standing male figure in the middle as a priest king standing before an altar here and feeding the sacred herd of the goddess Inanna, and this description is used until this day. However, if you go to Berlin and actually see the seal, you will note that the so-called altar here is really just a chip in the stone. This then changes the meaning of the scene as a whole. One must always look at the stone itself, and to do that, you must travel to the various collections, and in this case, to Berlin. Recently, a student also wrote that these animals, were untamed because they were depicted on a rocky mountainous landscape. Again, this mountainous landscape in reality is just damage to the bottom of the stone. Here is that detail. This is the seal stone itself, which I took a photograph through the case. And this is our hero. There's his face. There's his face. This is the big chip that is the altar. And these are the rough chips that are not mountainous landscape. And also what you don't see is that this seal has a magnificent silver sculpture of an animal on top as a handle that's set into the stone itself. And these are very, very rare. And secondly, so first is to see the seal and how it's really carved on it. And secondly, and perhaps more importantly, for the ancient Mesopotamians, it was the seal itself that was of greater significance. As I have mentioned, they were worn as amulets and had deep personal associations and significance for the wearer, and the stones themselves had their own intrinsic meanings. It is this personal and amuletic aspect of the seals which is often overlooked to this day. Before we go to the website, I want to show you one specific example in the Morgan that profoundly illustrates the tremendous importance of being able to combine the iconographic information with the material of the seal. First, let's discuss the iconography. Here is the seal, shown here only in the impression, from the end of the Mesopotamian sequence, dating to around 400 BC, when Mesopotamia had been defeated and absorbed into the Persian kingdom. The scene shows the Persian or Achaemenid king dominating lions, holding them up by their back legs and dangling them over two griffins. In a perfectly symmetrical composition where all the design elements focus attention upon the king and his power, the subject, the so-called master of the animals, of a heroic male being dominating animals, is perhaps among the longest lived motifs in art, and particularly in Mesopotamian art. And it had its origins in the late 4th millennium BC. Its first appearance is on the cylinder seal, perhaps the earliest in the Morgan's collection. It dates to about 3,300 BC, to a phase in Mesopotamian history called the late Uruk period. Is a large piece of serpentine shown in 3 views from the website above here and in my impression down below. At the center, right here, staring straight out at you, is the earliest known representation of a Cyclops hero anywhere in the world. And indeed, this is about 2,000 years before he becomes a prominent figure in Greek mythology and art. He starts in Mesopotamia. And many of my classical colleagues do not know this, but here he is in the Morgan collection in New York. So here is our staring eye of the Cyclops, and there you can see it in the seal itself. A pair of confronting lions stands on his shoulders. You see here the lion's tails, the bodies, and their forepaws are on his head. And then he's grasping lions by their hind legs and dangling them as they try to bite at his ankles. The lions that the Cyclops grasps symbolize the chaotic power of the natural world. Their domination emphasizes the hero's legendary strength and prowess. The heraldic scheme signifies the control of nature, elements that need containment to ensure survival. On the left, to fill out the scene, a magnificently horned animal is seated in a boat with only its head and wonderful horns visible above the rail of the boat. A lion-headed eagle swoops in to attack. And on the right, you have an animal standing also with wonderful horns, trying to steady a boat, acting as a human. And inside the boat is another animal acting as a human, casting a fishing net. Again, a lion-headed eagle is coming in to attack from above. Hybrid animals, as well as animals acting as humans, an active imagination that underpins all animal fables, are already found here and suggest a culture at the very dawn of history with well-developed myths in which animals play a central role. Let's just focus for a minute on the central figure of the Cyclops. There again, his staring eye. Notice how the whole design is beautifully worked as sort of a series of abstract angular lines, such as W's, let's say. Here, at the top with the two lions on his head, and then a larger one with his elbows, and then the largest of all at the bottom with the lions. There's the lion's head, the legs, the waist, the legs, and the lion. It's sort of a series of cascading W's, making a very beautifully proportioned design. Now, this is a tripartite composition, majorly three major elements: lion, hero, lion. And it really is a visualization of the idea of permanence, because if you take one element away, the whole idea of the design itself will collapse and throw off the balance. Now, I said this is the first example of the Cyclops image in Mesopotamian. What I really mean is this is the earliest known example. And look how beautifully formed this already is. Certainly, it must have had precedents which are now lost to us or unknown to us. About 900 years later, during the time of the early dynastic Sumerian temple states and the beginnings of our first cities, again, we are now around 2600 to 2300 BC, is the subject called the so-called contest scene, where domesticated animals are not involved in a conflict with wild animals, but they're not involved in a conflict. Wild animals are often attacking these domesticated animals, and a hero comes in to aid the domesticated animals. This rich lapis lazuli seal, as you can see in 4 views on the top, and it's a magnificent, pure piece of rich blue lapis lazuli, is inscribed here for a prince. And it shows one of these contest scenes of interconnected figures, creating a frieze across the surface of the seal. So here's a hero facing you with a dagger, grabbing a feline by the tail that attacks a stag, which is protected by a hero in the middle, protecting another stag with his arm wrapped around the neck, being attacked by a lion. This is our hero, master of the animals, in the middle of this contest scene. The subject here, by this time, has developed and evolved to represent one of the great cultic dramas of the Sumerians, and that is the eternal struggle between the forces of order and chaos, this eternal struggle, which is our shared fate. The lions representing the chaos of the natural world, with the domesticated animals and man representing the forces of order, and the struggle to impose order on the world around them. What's profound is that in the scenes on the seals, the battle is never clearly resolved, no winner and no clear loser. The Sumerians knew already then that this very struggle is a constant, and how fitting to carve this image on a cylindrical surface, with the scene endlessly repeating itself as you roll it. Now, about 1,000 years later, a very fine cylinder seal style evolved in the 14th and 13th century in the courts of the Assyrian kings, who had outstanding seal cutters in their entourage, and we saw 2 at the beginning of the talk with animals. This rock crystal seal has a complex design, combining naturalistically rendered figures in elaborately decorative schemes. Here's our master of the animals again, grasping 2 lions approaching him he's grasping by the wrist. They're standing on bulls. Then you have a winged sun disk, eagles flying in, griffins and sphinxes on either side of a stylized tree. A very complicated, packed scene full of design elements and all beautifully balanced. And here now is again the Persian seal, with the motif now used to emphasize here our king's majesty. This motif I've shown you has been evolving over 3,000 years, from our Cyclops to our master of the animals to the Middle Assyrian seal, and now to our Persian king. And it's all been cleaned up so that the focus really is now on the king himself. Now, please keep this motif in mind as we now turn to the stone itself. But before we go to the stone, I must introduce a new object that will play a very important role in our discussion. I've already mentioned Nebuchadnezzar. He is one of the most famous figures in history and is best known from biblical accounts. Nebuchadnezzar was a great general and statesman and a builder with ambition and imagination whose surviving monuments are without rival in Mesopotamia. The Babylon of Herodotus, including the Hanging Gardens, is largely the work of Nebuchadnezzar's architects. The monumental procession way and the Gate of Babylon, known as the Ishtar Gate, are all built by him. On the left is a picture at the beginning of the excavations of the Ishtar Gate. There it is, poking up out of the ground. And on the right are the finished excavations. You see this at the very top of one of these towers coming out of the ground. It's an extraordinary excavation. And here, a model on the left and a painting of the entire procession way and gate. The Morgan Library has an extraordinary object that belonged to Nebuchadnezzar. This bandit agate, about an inch in diameter, it was probably worn in a precious setting to judge by the chipped rim, the chipped state of the rim from which the setting was forcibly removed. You can see these little chips all the way around the rim. The natural banding in the stone of alternating brown and white bands have been carved to resemble an eye with its dark brown center and white circumference. And this class of objects, called by us today eye stone amulets, were worn to ward off evil. However, this eye stone is no ordinary example of a type. Around the edges of the brown circle inscribed in the finest miniature cuneiform this is some of the finest miniature cuneiform in existence, is an inscription. And you see it's right there, this inscription carved in stone, which was so easy just to impress in clay with wedges. Here it's carved into the stone. And the inscription says nothing less than the following, quote, "To Marduk his lord, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, son of Nabopolassar, gave this for his life," end of quote. In other words, this was given by Nebuchadnezzar as a votive object to be worn around the neck of the cult statue of the chief god of Babylon, Marduk, to continually protect Nebuchadnezzar's life. On the right is a reconstruction of part of Babylon with the great ziggurat in the center. And here is the Marduk temple, where the cult statue stood of Marduk wearing this very amulet given by Nebuchadnezzar to protect his own life. This eye stone agate was acquired by Morgan well over 100 years ago. The Morgan Library is justly proud of its 3 Gutenberg Bibles, but to include among its holdings tangible evidence of Nebuchadnezzar is not to be taken lightly. Now again, please keep in mind this bandit agate eye stone, as well as the motif of the hero dominating lions. On the screen is another page from Ward's 1910 publication, which introduced for the first time one of Morgan's great seals, the Persian seal, that is the focus of this part of the presentation. And it is here numbered 1109, and this is it. This is that seal in a very sketchy line drawing. The line drawing is crowded on a page of similar images showing the Persian king dominating or fighting animals. What you learn from this image is that the Persian king has taken unto himself the millennium-old image of heroes fighting lions and now put himself in that visual, even mythological function. But that is all you learn from this image. There is no mention in the text of the material, and you have no idea from this very sketchy drawing the quality of the carving, or is this as a great work of art? Get that from, excuse me, we'll just get that. Forgive the introduction. In the Parada publication, there is finally published a photograph of the impression, and one sees for the first time the extraordinary sense of certitude in the king's gestures, with the idea of permanence suggested by the very symmetry of the composition. You see these wonderful stretched out arms, the tremendous certitude that the artist has given the king in this position. The idea of permanence suggested, as I said, by the very symmetry in the composition. In the text of the Parada publication, the stone is mentioned as a Bandit Agate, but that is that. Notice on the impression from the Parada publication, these shadowy lines that go here and up and around here like this. Here, I don't know if you see all of that. They're very shadowy, and they are omitted from the line drawing in the War publication and unexplained by Parada. These lines can only be explained by viewing the stone itself. It is the very banding of the beautiful Bandit Agate here, leaving a mark in the impression as the cylinder is rolled, and the V-like dip of the natural occurring bands in the stone are incorporated by the seal carver to be centered right here on the pattern of the center of the king's garment, placing him right in the center with this beautiful line of the stone. But most importantly, that is not all. If you actually were able to turn the stone, as you now can on the website, this is what you will find. These are all images taken off the website. For the very first time, never before seen except for the few scholars who have had the privilege of examining the stone in person, one can now see that the eye part here, naturally occurring in the agate, has not been removed, and instead has been incorporated into the seal itself, thereby creating an even more potent amulet for the seal owner. But two things are at work here. First, the seal dates of the Persian or Achaemenid period, as I said, around 400 BC, when all of Mesopotamia had become a mere province of the mighty Persian Empire. The impression shows us that the Persian king has usurped the ancient image of Mesopotamian iconography, depicting power and control. And second, the stone itself shows us that the eye part of the agate has been left in the stone of the cylinder to be worn by the seal owner, rather than create a votive object to be given to the cult statue of a god. The only person important enough to wear such an agate, if not a god, would have to be royal. So the Morgan seal has now, with the information provided by the imagery as well as the visuals of the stone itself, unavailable previously, is to be elevated to the status of an actual royal seal. As we go to the website, please keep this in mind. There is a remarkable passage in the Old Testament where the actual rolling of a cylinder seal on clay is used to describe the landscape emerging from the darkness at dawn as an example of the majestic power of the Lord. It is among the Lord's admonitions to Job, 32:12, quote, "In all your life, have you ever called up the dawn or shown the morning its place? Have you ever taught it to grasp the fringes of the earth and shake the dog star in its place, to bring up the horizon in relief as clay under a seal, until all things stand out like the folds of a cloak," end of quote. With these images on the Morgan's website, we are actually coming close to providing the visual visitor with the experience of handling the seal and observing magnified details with spectacular results. Putting works of art on the internet is an extraordinary tool, but even more so for the seals, because for the first time, multiple views of the seals, the object itself, have been made available. This is new and crucial information, never before readily available. Here at the Morgan, and I hope when we reopen, you will have a chance to visit this room. Visitors are able to see the Morgan's legendary seal collection on display in the north room of the McKim, an installation of clarity and elegance not found anywhere else. Here are the seals in cases around the perimeter of the room. And on the web, we have provided our virtual visitor and scholar with an equally unparalleled experience to be found on no other museum site. So thank you to my great colleagues, Dan, Marilyn, and always Graham, and to the funders, Jonathan and Jeanette Rosen. And this is a very beautiful seal of also from the Achaemenid Persian period that ends our sequence of Mesopotamian seals. And look at the beauty of that stone, this beautiful honey-colored chalcedony. And here's just a bull striding on a landscape all by itself. And look at the lighting that Graham caught here on the horn and the face of the bullet. That's an exquisite still life all by itself. And yes, this is a chip on the stone. So now let us go briefly to the website, and you can now see this for yourself. And you just go to any of your browsers, you look up the Morgan Library Museum, click on that. Oh, I did click on that. Go back a second. And then you go to collections. This is all very easy. And you go to collections, highlights, and scroll down to Ancient Near Eastern Seals and Tablets. Click on that and you get a little introduction, but go right to Browse Images. So when you go to Browse Images, you get all of the seals that are on view in the North Room, plus some extras. There are about 100 things now on the website. I like to look at, rather than 10 to a page, I like to go right to 40 because I want to see them as many as possible all at once. So you go to 40 and then apply, and then you get 40, and you scroll down to choose any you like. I'm just going to show us several. They are really just so exquisite, and to have this tool. Let's just try this one, 3 Stags of the Plant. You can either go right to Rotate Seal or Read More. I prefer to start with Read More because it gives you then the seal impression and the seal. So then if you go to Zoom Image, you get a wonderful screen showing you the impression, and you can, of course, enlarge it and look at any detail you want, and they're really just spectacular. This is a extraordinary tool. And what I love about this seal is that this is a real artist at work, stylizing these wonderful stag horns across the surface at the top of the seal to create a very pleasing, elegant work of art. But that's not all. Each of the animals is really different. Look how they're moving across the surface of the seal. These legs are tight, these are further apart. This one is really moving. So then you X that out and you go to Rotate Seal. And then what will happen, the seal will rotate quickly in front of you, but you can slow it down. You can enlarge it and then use this cursor, this tool here, and turn it yourself, or you can just do it yourself and slow it down, and you come to wonderful, wonderful images. I love this view of the seal. You can just see, it's a whole still life in itself. Our animal here, you can see the indentation on this side and the beautiful horns, and you can just delight in the seal carver carving this object. And remember that what you're looking at is an artist working backwards, carving in the round in the negative. And that's an extraordinary accomplishment. And we'll go back to the website, and I'd share 2 more with you because I know our time is moving. These are all magnificent. The lapis lazuli seal we looked at earlier. And let's just go down. There's one particular one I want to share with you for a number of reasons. And we'll go to page 2. And it's also from the Middle Assyrian period. And it's also a Bandit Agate. And there's our leaping stag. And it is this seal. So we'll read more. And in this case, I'm going to go right to the rotating seal first, because I want you to see this Bandit Agate. Instead of dark or brown and white layers, it is translucent layers with white. And it's impossible to see what you're carving on this very complex surface. It's extraordinary. There's maybe, I don't know what that is, the eye perhaps of an animal. You turn it again, and there's perhaps a star up here, yes. And just zoom in and look. It's just a magnificent surface, extraordinary. And then, so now we'll go to the seal itself, and on this very complicated surface, look at what the artist has achieved. It is a masterpiece of sculptured art. Here's a lion attacking a mouflon, and all the action is in these arcs and curves. The lion's tail is taut. The threatened animal's face is between the paws of the lion. And look, there's even a startled expression in the animal's face as it tries to leap up and get away from the attacking lion. So I encourage you all to just browse on these and just zoom in on all of these. And I'll just show you one more, just so that you see. The final page has the wonderful eye stone, as well as the seal that we focused on with the eye stone built into it. But on the page before, and it's the final image I will leave you with, is the Great Seal, which is a beautiful, beautiful red carnelian. And it's, of course, this one. And we'll go to rotate the seal. And I want to leave you with this spectacular image. Great detail of our winged genius. And you can see the extraordinary detail on this seal that's only about an inch high. So thank you, and please take time and browse through these remarkable seals. And thank you for your patience. It's hard for me to restrain myself from not showing you all of them, but so be it. Thank you.
Sydney, thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. It's so great to see the details of works that we normally can see at the museum, but on such a great, closer level than ever before. We do have some questions. Unfortunately, due to the time, we can't get to everyone, but we do have a few questions that we can ask. The first one relates to your process of creating those impressions. Could you sort of explain more what you do and the materials that you use to create them?
Yes, I do. It's if you go to the website, you can see me actually doing it, and that might be actually more helpful. But I use a material that's available commercially called Sculpey 3, and I use semi-firm, and I use a color which is not available at last commercially. It's called Museum Gray, but you can use Elephant Gray, which is fine. And the reason why I use gray, it comes in all kinds of different colors. But when I first started doing all of this many years ago, photography was in black and white, and gray photographed beautifully in black and white. And I still use the gray because I don't want to introduce a different color to detract from the beauty of the stones. So then you roll out, you have to knead it till it gets very soft and very, very malleable. You take a stone rolling pin, not a wooden one, because a wooden one can leave marks or get gunk, and you roll it out like you would a pie crust. Then you use talcum powder, a caldacine. I'm not plugging caldacine, but that's the one to use because it doesn't have all the other impurities that others do, or the carcinogens that some of them we now know do. And then you rub that in like flour onto a pie crust to smooth it as much as possible. And unfortunately, the process also, when you're kneading it, sometimes air bubbles get into the surface of your material, and you have to take a little pin and pierce all the air bubbles and then gently coax the air out and reflatten it. And then you stand up and you place the cylinder in the seal, you guide it with these two fingers on either side, and then you alternate pressure with your thumbs, and you roll and roll as carefully as possible with as much steady pressure as possible, because you don't want to get ridges, or you don't want to push or distend the image. And this is really, it takes practice. It takes a lot of practice to get good impressions. Sometimes I can do one in a minute, and sometimes it takes me an hour. It also depends on the seal and how deeply carved to get all of the details. It's a complicated process, and I spend years trying to get these correct. And as I age, eyesight, it becomes an issue. So anyway, I mean, I probably won't. And then you bake them, and they don't change shape once you bake them. Okay.
Our next question pertains to Pierpont Morgan himself. What sort of inspired him to collect the cylinder seals?
That's a wonderful question and a topic for an entire lecture. It's an extraordinary story. Morgan came of age during the time when a man named Layard discovered the great Assyrian palaces in around 1850 or so in northern Mesopotamia. And it was the removal of these extraordinary stone carvings from the palaces by the French and the British that filled the British Museum, the Louvre, that created extraordinary excitement during this time. And don't forget, this was the time of great scientific discovery. And these scientific discoveries were challenging people's faith. And here, in spite of that, was evidence that the Old Testament kings really existed. Morgan and people of his generation were riveted by this. And indeed, in 1 year alone, when the reliefs from the Assyrian palaces made their way to the British Museum, 900,000 people went to see them. This was the first blockbuster in museum history. And then when cuneiform was finally, the code was finally cracked after a very long struggle in around 1860 or so, these were the names that people knew from the Old Testament, and people were riveted. In fact, Layard's book, Nineveh and Its Remains, you couldn't get copies of it. It was one of the bestsellers. They were endless editions. Pirated copies were made. And actually, Morgan purchased these seals, or some of them were purchased on behalf of for the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and were there for a short period of time. And Morgan was ahead of his time. His fellow board members did not really appreciate this material the way he did. And there's a board meeting when they're discussing all this material, and Morgan says, well, I'll be happy to take them to my library. So he purchased them back from the Met, and they have been a treasured collection of the library ever since.
Thank you. We have time for one more question, and that pertains to, do we know anything about the artists who actually created the seals themselves, the carvers of the seals?
Very good question. It is all anonymous. All that we know is that in rations, in the temple inventories of workforces, there are stone cutters and stone carvers, and that's about it.
Well, thank you so much again for this wonderful presentation, and thank you to all of our attendees who have taken part. And if you're interested in more programs like this, of course, we ask that you go to www.themorgan.org/Morgan-Connected. There you'll find a schedule of upcoming virtual presentations, as well as past recordings of Morgan lectures and concerts that took place at the Morgan, and as well as blog posts and many other things that the Morgan has. So thank you again, and I hope you all have a wonderful afternoon.